So gas exchange. So we already know what are the respiratory organs which are related or which helps in the gaseous exchange as well as the transport of the gases. So generally this gas exchange occurs between two things. Okay, so the first one is between the alveoli and the blood, and the second one is the between the blood and tissues. Okay, so out of this, whatever the alveoli is there, because they are the structure and function unit of lungs, so hence the primary site for the gaseous exchange will be the alveoli. So now whenever we breathe or whenever we respire, there are two gases which are important. One is the O2 and other one is the CO2. Okay, so because they are gases, so the process of whatever exchange is there, it will be diffusion. Okay, so whatever intake of the oxygen, giving out of the carbon dioxide with the help of this diffusion process, it all depends upon certain factors. Okay, so let's see how the factors affects this O2 and CO2 release and intake. So whenever we consider the factors, there are generally, it depends upon how much soluble the gases are, or whatever this one is the membranes which are there in the lungs or the tissues. What is the thickness of that particular membrane? Okay, what is the pressure gradient between them? Means what is the difference between the two types of gases when it is compared to the atmospheric pressure? So depending upon certain factors only, we are going to see such things. So the first factor which you're going to see is the pressure or concentration gradient. Okay, so in the pressure or concentration gradient, this depends upon what? Something which is called as the partial pressure. Now, what is this partial pressure? Partial pressure means if we take oxygen and CO2 as an individual gas. Okay, so what is the individual pressure of that particular gas in a gaseous mixture? That particular thing is called as what? Pressure gradient or concentration gradient. So here we are going to see with respect to the two gases, that is O2 and CO2. So this will be like in the form of mmHg. Okay, mmHg form. So it will include all the things like the atmospheric pressure, how much gas is present in the alveoli, whether it's in a deoxygenated blood, oxygenated blood, whether it's present in the tissues, everything we have to consider. And depending upon that only, this concentration gradient will vary. For example, if you take this one, alveoli, which is the first one. Okay, so if you take alveoli, whatever the PO2 concentration, that is the partial gradient for the O2 which is there in the alveoli, that is more. If you compare the other parts, that is the capillary or the tissues or whatever it is there, in alveoli, whatever the PO2 concentration is there, that will be more. That is about 104 mmHg. Whereas the same thing if you're considering in capillaries, that is your blood capillaries, it will be less, that is 40 mmHg. So where that particular O2 will diffuse more. So O2 is going to diffuse where? Into the capillary blood. Whereas if you consider the oxygenated, deoxygenated blood, if you take the deoxygenated blood, here it is 45 mmHg. So 45 mmHg in deoxygenated blood it is there. So whatever the diffusion of the CO2, if you consider, that will be where? To the alveoli over here. So the diffusion, depending upon the concentration gradient or the pressure gradient only, which gas is going to diffuse where. Okay, so if you take oxygen, the diffusion where it will be in the capillary blood, so that it can supply oxygenated blood throughout your body, and once that blood is coming back, it will come with the Carbon dioxide. So where will that carbon dioxide diffuse and finally get excreted, or what do you say, exhaled? That is the alveoli. Okay, so the diffusion of oxygen, capillaries, okay, and the diffusion of carbon dioxide is alveoli. So this all depends upon concentration gradient. That is the first factor. Now the second factor which is there, it's the solubility of gases. So solubility of gases means, again here the two gases, oxygen and CO2. Now if you take the CO2, okay, the solubility of that CO2 is higher as compared to that of what? Oxygen. So CO2 having higher solubility. That is approximately, it has 20, it means 20 to 25 times more soluble it is than oxygen. Okay, so how it is written is, whatever amount of carbon dioxide is there, that can diffuse through the membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is higher than that of O2. So hence the diffusion property of CO2 is more as compared to oxygen. That is why when you go to places where burning takes place, okay, so obviously carbon dioxide is produced more. So there easily you get suffocated. That is because your membranes are going to absorb the CO2 at a faster rate as compared to the oxygen. Then next factor which is there is the thickness of membrane. Now usually whatever diffusion membranes are there, they are made up of three layers. So first layer is of the squamous epithelium. Second is the endothelium. And third is the basement substance. So whatever the squamous epithelium is there, it's in case of the alveoli. Okay, the endothelium, that is again of the alveoli only, but the capillaries which are related to it. So alveolar capillaries. Whereas the basement substance will be between these two. Okay, so if you take the total thickness of that particular diffusion membrane, it's about 0.5 mm. So because of this, what happens is easy gas exchange takes place. Okay, so in the lungs, at the end of that bronchioles only, you're having what? The alveoli. So if you're having like this, okay, so this one will be what? The alveolar cavity. Surrounding to this, there will be certain tissues or membrane like this. Okay, so in between whatever the space is there, this is the basement membrane. Now through this thing, your RBCs will be flowing. Okay, so this is generally what? The capillaries, where the blood flows. Okay, so this is how generally how it looks like, means the three types of membranes which are there. Okay, so because of the perfect thickness, that is, which is about 0.5 mm, easy gas exchange will take place. Then the fourth factor, which is the surface area, very important. Now, actually, if the alveoli is increased, okay, means if the presence of the alveoli increases, then what happens is whatever your surface area of the lungs is, that will also increase. Means more the surface area of the alveoli, that much air you can get into your lungs. Okay, so hence surface area is very important as it increases the gaseous exchange. So hence the presence of alveoli increases surface area of lungs. So because of that, there is a increase in gaseous exchange. Okay, so once this exchange is been done between the alveoli and the capillaries, okay, so obviously it will take place between what the blood and the tissues. It has to get transported throughout the body. So the next thing that we are going to see is what? How does this gas actually get transported? So gas transport. Okay, so again, here two types of gases, O2 and CO2. So the first thing that we are going to see is the O2. Okay, so now from where does this O2 get transported? Is from the lungs to tissues. Correct. So whatever the transport of the oxygen is there mainly takes place by two ways or two methods. The first one is the blood plasma, also called as physical solution, wherein the oxygen is going to get transported. So in this blood plasma, which is already present in the blood, okay, so over here, this blood plasma will carry about 3% of oxygen. That also in dissolved state. So easily absorption will take place. Then the second one, which is very important, that is the oxyhemoglobin. Okay, now what happens is already hemoglobin is present in our blood. So hemoglobin are the pigments which is going to carry the oxygen. They will carry it throughout the body. And once the oxygen is absorbed by the tissues and everything, what happens is it carries the carboxyhemoglobin. Means it carries the carbon dioxide with the combined with the hemoglobin is called as carboxyhemoglobin, which is then transported back to the lungs for the what do you say, exhalation purpose. So oxyhemoglobin. Now this here only 97% of the oxygen is been absorbed, or you can say transported. Okay, so hemoglobin, as we know that it's a red colored pigment containing iron. Correct. So what happens over here is whatever O2 is there, it is going to bind with the HP and thereby it forms what? Oxyhemoglobin. And this process is only called as what? Oxygenation. So usually if you take a hemoglobin molecule, okay, it will be having 4 iron units or 4 Hem units. Okay, so 4 Hem units means what? Each molecule of the hemoglobin will be able to carry how much molecules of oxygen? 4 molecules of oxygen. So how much oxygen is going to bind? Okay, again, this depends upon certain factors. Okay, so whatever binding of the oxygen is there, it will depend upon certain factors. What are the factors? Already we have seen one factor, which is the PO2, that is the partial or the concentration gradient. Okay, so PO2. Then second one is what? The H plus ion concentration. Okay, which is nothing but your pH of the blood. And the last one is the temperature. So depending upon these three factors only, how much amount of oxygen is going to bind, it will decide. So if you write this as, it becomes like this. Okay, hemoglobin, O2, Hb4O4, O8. So here high PO2, here low PO2. So this will be from the lungs. This will be going back from the tissues. Okay, so if you compare here in this formula only we are in this equation only we can understand that in the alveoli there will be what? A higher amount of the PO2. That is the concentration gradient of the O2. Okay. So in alveoli, high PO2, low PCO2, that is carbon dioxide, then low H plus ion concentration and low temperature. But everything will be opposite when it is coming back. Okay, so if this particular things are there, then it is called as what? A favorable condition for the hemoglobin formation, or sorry, oxyhemoglobin formation. Condition for oxyhemoglobin formation. But if you come back to the reverse one like this, what will happen is low PO2, high concentration of the what do you say, carbon dioxide, high H plus and high temperature will be there. Okay. So this is how the oxygen transportation takes place. So depending upon how that diffusion takes place, okay, there is also a graph which is known as oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So basically this particular thing gives us an idea about the partial pressure of the oxygen and how much of it is present in the hemoglobin, that particular oxygen. Okay, so here when you draw a graph, you're going to get a sigmoid curve like this. Okay, so here it will be the partial pressure of oxygen, whereas on the other side you will be having what? The percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. So this type of curve is what? Sigmoid. So when depending upon what type of sigmoid curve you're getting, okay, it will determine that how much percentage saturation of the oxygen is present in the hemoglobin. Okay, so this basically is this graph which is there. It is used to study the factors which we have seen earlier, like the H plus concentration. Okay, how or the what do you say, partial carbon dioxide concentration and all those stuff. So depending upon this graph study only, we'll be able to know how much of the oxygen is going to bind with the HP. So next one is the CO2 transport. So now this will be from the tissues to the lungs. From tissues to lungs. So now here what happens is, if you consider a tissue, okay, in that the concentration of the, means the concentration gradient of the carbon dioxide will be high. And why it is high? It is due to the catabolism. And what do you say, the partial concentration of the oxygen is also low. So when there is a low oxygen concentration and high CO2 concentration, so at that time only the carbon dioxide transportation takes place. So this is in case of the tissues. But if you take lungs over here, so in lungs what will happen is, whatever the partial gradient of the CO2, that is carbon dioxide, that will be low and O2 will be high. That's just the opposite. Okay, so when this particular factors have been maintained, then only the CO2 transportation is being favored from the tissues to the lungs. So if this has to happen, there are three ways in which it can happen. Okay, so the first one which is there is called as the carbonic acid, means in the form of carbonic acid. So carbonic acid means what? The carbon dioxide in the acidic form. So here what happens is, in tissues, about 7% of the CO2, it gets dissolved in your plasma water. So when it is dissolved, it is going to form something which is called as what? Carbonic acid. And this form may be carried where? To the lungs. This is the first way that the carbon dioxide may go out. Second is in the form of carb amino hemoglobin. So this also obviously in the tissue only, but here the percentage will be more, that is 20 to 25% CO2. This is because the name itself, if you see carb amino hemoglobin, so where it is going to bind, 20 to 25% of the carbon dioxide is going to bind to the hemoglobin. And then it will form something which is called as carb amino hemoglobin. Okay, so here whatever the dissociation of that carbon dioxide, once it reaches in the lungs, it will be in the alveoli. Whatever the splitting of the carbon dioxide is, that one will take place. Then the third form where it can pass is the bicarbonates as a bicarbonate. So yeah. So here, if you see in the bicarbonate form, this is the largest, what do you say, base in which the carbon dioxide is excreted out. That is about 70% of CO2 is transported by this method itself. So in this, what happens is, there will be whatever the RBC which you're having, that is the red blood cells, that only contains what? Hemoglobin, right? So apart from that, the RBC also contain an enzyme which is called as what? Which is called as carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so what happens is in the tissue, there will be certain reactions in the presence of this carbonic anhydrase. So all the things are taking place where? In the tissues only. But whatever the transportation is there, it will be in the bicarbonate form. So the equation will be CO2 plus H2O. So it's a reversible thing. So bicarbonate plus hydrogen ion. So here both the things will be taking place in the presence of this enzyme only, carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so when this bicarbonate is going to reach your lung, okay, that is the alveoli, at that time, this particular reaction will proceed in the opposite direction. Okay, means what happens is, when this reaches in the alveoli, the above reaction which I have written, it is going to proceed in opposite direction. That's why two arrows are there. So it will lead to formation of what? Same thing, formation of CO2 and water, H2O. Okay, so deoxygenated blood, it carries this particular bicarbonates or whatever three forms, carbonic acid and carbaminohemoglobin is there. Deoxygenated blood takes this thing. So if you consider 100 ml of deoxygenated blood, it will deliver about 4 ml of, what do you say, carbon dioxide to the alveoli. Okay, so this is how the carbon dioxide is being transported from the tissues to the lungs and excreted out. So the last part of this chapter, that is regulation of respiration. Okay, so whatever, what do you say, respiratory centers, which we say, where the respiration is regulated, it is obviously the brain. Okay, so in the brain, you have certain respiratory centers. So the first one is called as what? Respiratory rhythm center. So respiratory rhythm center means nothing but whatever the inspiratory and expiratory centers, they are only called as respiratory rhythm centers. So this is basically in the medulla oblongata part of the brain. Okay, so whatever the rhythm between this expiration and inspiration, that is inhalation and exhalation is there, that is generally controlled over here in the medulla oblongata part of the brain. Second is called as the pneumotaxic center. Pneumotaxic center. So in the pons part, this is present. Okay, so here what it does is, again, moderately it will act as a respiratory rhythm center. Plus what it will do is, like how, see, whatever the hot object or cold object, we can know that by the impulses, right? So whatever the impulse thing is there, that also is being controlled over here only. Okay, so from this center, whatever the impulse you get during the expiration or the inspiration, that rate which is there is controlled in this pons of the brain. Okay, so here we can write it as impulse from the center reduces the duration of inspiration. So because of that, what will happen is whatever your respiratory rhythm rates is there, that will differ. Then the third one, which is there, is called as chemosensitive area. So chemosensitive area means what? This is the highly, what do you say, sensitive, this one, a center for the rhythm to occur. Okay, so here this is adjacent to the whatever two types of rhythm centers we saw. So here what happens is, here there will be an increase in concentration of CO2 and H plus. So because of that, this center gets activated, and when this center gets activated, when the center chemosensitive area is activated, when there is a increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide and H plus, which is not good obviously. So because of that, this center will get activated. And when this center activates, it is going to control your rhythm center. Okay, means it will give a signal to the rhythm center that the CO2 and H plus concentration is more. Okay, so what happens is you have to balance this particular thing. So because of that, what happens is whatever receptors will be present over there, which there is two types actually of the receptors which are present in this chemosensitive area, which is called as aortic arch and carotid artery. So this together, okay, they will recognize if there is a change in the carbon dioxide and H plus concentration. And if they find a change, automatically it will turn on the signal, and that signal is going to go to the rhythm, respiratory rhythm center. Okay, so here the oxygen role which is there, that doesn't play a major part, because this all depends upon the concentration of CO2. Okay, so here oxygen is not going to play a important role in what? In controlling your rate of respiration. So that is very important. CO2 plays a very important role. So respiration is obviously a very important activity in a living organism. Why? Because it gives us certain functions, or it plays certain roles. Okay, so what are the functions of this respiration? Now, certain functions which we can see is what? First one is ATP production, means the energy production. Second one is what? Temperature is maintained. Okay, third, it also, because pH is there, so acid-base balance also it helps in. Okay, so if there is any, what do you say, like if there is any increase in the carbon dioxide or less oxygen has been taken in, by that person, it will lead to what certain disorders of the respiratory system. Okay, so now what kind of disorders with the respiratory system may happen? So the first thing or the first type of disorder which is there is the asthma, the most common thing. So asthma means we all know it's nothing but wheezing sound is being produced when the person breathes or difficulty in the breathing. Okay, all those stuff is called as what? Asthma. Difficulty in breathing. And during that process, wheezing sound is being produced. Okay, so this mainly happens whenever your bronchi are inflamed. Okay, so this is basically a common type of allergic reactions whenever you get, what do you say, irritated to like pollens or something like that, then this asthma is there. Okay, so even during asthma, what happens is in your respiratory tract, excess amount of mucus will be there, so you will not be able to breathe properly. Okay, then the second one, emphysema. So emphysema, which is there, it is nothing but the complete, what do you say, damage of your alveolar walls. Okay, so because of that, when the alveolar walls get damaged, the surface area will get decreased, and obviously you cannot take more amount of oxygen. So it will lead to the disorder. So damage to alveolar walls. Okay, so thereby it decreases what? The respiratory surface. Like mainly the people who smoke cigarette and all those stuff. So for them, this may happen. Then the third one is the occupational respiratory disorder. So occupational respiratory disorder means what? Like the people who work in certain industries like mining or something where dust is involved in major amount. So those person may be having this occupational respiratory disorder. Means according to their occupation, their work, this disorder is there. So in that what happens is your defense mechanism, they will not be able to connect with whatever work you're going to do. Okay, and when that person is exposed like to a longer time to that particular dust or something, then it is going to lead to what? Inflammation of fibrous tissues. And that thing is called as what? Fibrosis. So ultimately, whatever workers in the industries are there, they will get a lung damage. And because of that only, mask and all those stuff, it should be provided. And the last one, which is there, is the pneumonia. So pneumonia, basically, it's an acute type of infection. Okay, so here also the alveoli gets inflamed. So pneumonia is basically due to an bacteria which is called as Streptococcus pneumoniae. Okay, so because your alveoli gets inflamed, the airspace again decreases, fluid gets deposited in your lungs. Okay, and the gases exchange will not be as smooth as it was. So this are what the disorders of a respiratory system.